Hey guys, this is Zoltan and you are watching Phalanx Miniatures, and today we are going to be building some basic cobblestone bases for our Cursed City miniatures, or any fantasy miniature for that matter. When I was doing my video for the Cursed City Heroes speed painting session, which you can check by the way in the right corner, I was faced with this problem of how do I base them, because as usual I forgot to base the models when I was assembling them and I needed something for the painting session. I could have gone with something fancy, of course, like 3D printing something or buying something, but fancy doesn't really go very well with speed painting, so I decided to go with milliput. Milliput was perfect because it's super flexible in what I can do with it, and some of the minis I wanted to fully stand on the cobbled stones, and some of the others I wanted to have on these like streets that are sinking into the mud, because they already had some rocks molded and sculpted around their feet. So what I did is I just took a big chunk of milliput, prepared it, and then smashed it onto the base, and then started to like work with it slowly. I was using this very handy tool with the rubber end to mold it to what I needed, and then as I figured out what the whole thing kind of looks like, I was just taking chunks out of it as I needed to, and like forming it as I was going, which you can do easily if you just add some water onto the tip of the rubber tip of the tool. Adding water to the milliput immediately softens it up and it just allows you to shape it the way you want it. Once I was relatively happy with the overall shape, which is imperfect by design by the way, because you need these imperfections to sell this as natural stone. So then I needed to make it look like a road. So I was using this little instrument that is, I think, a dental instrument, but you can use something else. I would suggest to use something that is not super sharp, because otherwise these grooves or indentations are going to be a bit too sharp as well. So you could be using, let's say, the back or the blunt side of a knife. So what you do is you do these parallel lines, as you can see, because that's the way the stones are placed, and then you put little grooves between those lines to represent the gaps between the stones. And the trick to sell the effect is to not put those grooves next to each other, right? Because if you look at a paved road or a cobbled road, then these stones are never right next to each other. They are always slightly shifted compared to the one next to them. Once I was done with this, I just needed to clean it up a bit, because every time I put a groove in, I also shifted the other ones. That's just the nature of milliput, but that's super easy to clean up by just like sharpening the gaps a little bit. And now we just need a little bit of extra detail to sell this, because stone, as I said before, is imperfect, and this is an old road, some of it already sinking into the mud. There's going to be damage, there is going to be little indentations into the stone and cracks and crevices and so forth. So I'm just carving away a little bit here and there, putting a little bit of a scratch over the whole thing, and later this is going to help us to make the whole thing look a little bit more 3D and more believable by shading and highlighting it. With the base done, I needed to now add the model on top of the base. And because it's a Cursed City model, it has this little pin that is going into the base. Usually there's a hole for it. So I needed to push that through the clay or the milliput, because I didn't want to wait until the whole thing is set, and I needed to drill and scrape it away. So I created a little hole so that I know where the pin should go into, and then I just pushed it in, and it didn't really disturb the milliput too much, fortunately for me. So I just adjusted the base, especially the rim, a little bit, and otherwise I was mostly done. With some of the other models I had to readjust the little grooves that I did that were pushed aside by the model itself, but in general it was not a big issue. For some of the other models that don't have the full base covered by the cobblestones, but they sink into the mud, I added the mud by applying, I think it was Vallejo Earth texture, and I just put it everywhere where the cobblestone is not, being careful not to put it on where it shouldn't go. But it's not a big issue if you actually like have a little bit on the stones, because that's just natural, right? The mud just like splatters onto stuff. And here's the end result after priming and zenithal highlighting. This is where we can start the painting session. So let's move on to painting. And as you can see, there is already a lot of color on the white primer, which shows you why it's probably a good idea to paint the base not in the beginning, right? Because then you're just going to have a lot of colors on top of it. If it's underneath the contrast paint, it's actually not a problem. It's maybe a good thing because it adds some color variety to the whole thing. So I'm using Basilicanum Gray here, and I cover the whole base, taking care to put the paint into all the crevices so they are nice and dark. And once I am done with this, what I'm also going to do is to add a little bit more color, even though there was a little bit underneath from the painting process of the model. I also added a bit of, if I remember correctly, Militarum green, but any green would do to make it a little bit more interesting. It might look pretty bad, but it's going to be covered by the next step, which is dry brushing different tan colors on top of it, because I don't really want stone to look like gray, right? Stone is usually not gray, so I want to have a little bit of gray in there, black obviously in the crevices, and then a little bit of green showing through, you know, that moss and whatever else. And then I want to make the whole thing kind of like this nice tan color overall. So I'm using Zendri Dust as my first dry brushing color. Once I'm satisfied with the amount of Zendri Dust that I brushed on, which means that I can still see the grays underneath and even a little bit of the greens, I can move on to the next highlight, which is going to be Tallern Sand. This is a bit brighter, and I will apply less of it so that now we can see the Zendri Dust and the gray and the green underneath, right? So I'm using it a bit more sparingly. I'm not doing a very good job here, and I don't really need to. This can be a bit messy, right? Because once again, we have speed painting, that's one thing. And the other thing is that this is the base. It doesn't have to look perfect. Of course, if you want to make it look super perfect, then you can go for that as well. And then the final one, the final highlight that I'm going to be using is Carrick Stone, which is much brighter. So I'm mostly going for the edges, especially on the outside perimeter of the base. And if I did my job right, then now everything is nicely highlighted, but we can still see all the previous colors to a certain extent underneath. And for the models that have mud around the base, around the stones, I use contrast paint, specifically Agar's Dunes, to just paint everything. I think this is the perfect paint for this kind of stuff. With the dry brushing, I highlighted the model, but with that I also destroyed some of the contrast that the contrast paint created. So I'm bringing that back now with a wash. And you could use a normal wash for this, an acrylic wash, but I'm using oil wash because I can also easily remove it from the upper surfaces so that it doesn't stain the whole thing. You can go for a normal one, just be aware that then it's going to be darker than mine in the end. To finish the base, I'm doing a bit of edge highlighting, and actually really easy edge highlighting because we want to actively avoid painting perfect lines, since that would ruin the effect of this broken stone road. So what I'm doing is I'm just applying a bit of Carrick Stone and apply it wherever I feel the edge needs a little bit of a highlight. I also make sure that I highlight those little dents and scrapes that I created before on top of the stones, because that will once again help sell the effect. To tie this in with the rest of the models that I already painted, and especially on those models that have mud on them, I added a little bit of light orange oxide from Green Stuff World. This is a dry pigment, and I think this really makes those bases pop. At this stage, all we need is to paint the rims black and call this paint job done. And the final result looks something like this. If you like the content and it was helpful to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. See you guys in the next one.